There is a silence coming from heaven that is not of peace, but of warning. A silence that cuts through time as if the entire universe were waiting for something inevitable. Have you ever felt that the world is on the verge of something big, but you don't know how to explain what? The scriptures reveal, before the sound of the trumpets, even the heavens stand still. Because what comes next is not just history, it is judgment. And when the first sound echoes, nothing will be the same again. This is not a message of fear, it is a divine cry, a final call. Stay until the end. Because when the trumpet sounds, your soul needs to be awake. Most great stories begin with an explosion, a bold gesture, or a revolution that disrupts the natural course of things. But there is a moment in Scripture when everything stops. Heaven, earth, angels, crowds, all are silent. No voice, no sound, not even the echo of eternal praise. A dense, almost unbearable silence. It's as if all creation holds its breath. And the question that lingers, even if unspoken, is inevitable. What is about to happen? Few people realize that in the book of Revelation, before the most feared judgments ever recorded begin, the entire sky is plunged into silence for about half an hour. This is not an empty silence, but one charged with expectation, with tension, like the muffled sound before thunder. Why does heaven, where there is constant worship, suddenly cease all sound? The answer, though disconcerting, is straightforward. The silence announces that something of cosmic proportions will be revealed. An unprecedented judgment, a warning that will resound irreversibly. The book of Revelation is not just a tale of distant visions, it is a spiritual mirror, a portrait of the conflict between the sacred and the profane, between divine patience and human response. When the 7 trumpets are given to the angels, they are not merely symbolic instruments. Each sound will be a call, each blast a limit crossed. They announce not only destruction, but also mercy. Amidst the chaos, there are still voices that urge reflection. It is as if heaven were saying, there is still time. The ancient Hebrews had a profound understanding of sound as a sacred instrument. Trumpets were not just objects of war or celebration, they marked the time of divine action. In the desert, when the people were walking among mountains and dangers, a single note was enough to change the course of an entire crowd. That is why the trumpets in Revelation are not accidental. They follow a precise sequence, each with a definite purpose, and each heavenly intervention is measured, timed, inevitable. The first question that needs to be addressed is whether these trumpets are symbolic or literal. Throughout history, many scholars have debated whether the events described by John represent spiritual judgments, natural disasters, wars, or even ecological civilizational collapses. Interestingly, despite so much divergence, there is a clear convergence among interpreters. The sound of the trumpets marks moments of decision. They function as watersheds, as non-negotiable milestones in the time of humanity. This is a reality that escapes modern logic, which seeks scientific explanations, empirical proof, cause and effect. However, the apocalypse does not surrender to conventional logic. It breaks it. It declares that there will be a time when the consequences will not only be natural, but spiritual, and that human choices shape these consequences. We live in times when there is increasing talk of the end, collapse, and the point of no return. Climate change, geopolitical tension, the disintegration of values, existential crises. But what if all of this is just the echo of something older, deeper? What if the reality we see is just the surface of something that has been warned about for millennia? The trumpets do not sound only on the physical plane, they reverberate within consciousness. The first strikes the ground, the basis of what was created. The second reaches the seas, the source of life and commerce. The third contaminates the rivers, the daily sustenance. The fourth strikes the heavens, the order of time and light. The fifth opens portals that should remain closed. The sixth releases the invisible army of death. The seventh does not destroy, it reveals. And between one and the other, there is a chance. Not a passive chance, but an urgent invitation. Perhaps the most disturbing thing about the sound of the trumpets is their intermittent nature. No one trumpet exterminates everything. Each one strikes a part, a third. This is not random. It is a measure of mercy in the midst of judgment, a reminder that all is not lost, an appeal from God to the human conscience. Some see it as a chance, others see it as only terror. Revelation was never a book of horrors. It was written to awaken, to warn, to reveal. In light of this, we are not simply faced with a religious story. We are faced with a message that spans centuries and reaches us today. It forces us to ask, if the trumpets were to begin to sound, what would they find in our world? What would they reveal about our choices, our priorities, who we have become? And more than that, would we still listen? The sky was silent, but not forever. When the first sound rang out, there was no turning back. The time for warning had come, and this warning, more than a punishment, is a cry, not for fear, but for return, for recognition, for restoration. The first touch brought not words, but fire. There was no discussion, no warning, no argument. A decision had been made, and it was made upon that which had been called good from the beginning, the earth. But now, this very soil, destined for life, became the first to bear the weight of man's rejection of the divine order. What was fertile was burned. What was green was consumed. A third of all vegetation was gone, not as a result of an accident, but as part of a directed judgment. The first trumpet directly affects the visible creation, that which touches our feet, sustains food, and shelters life. Trees, lawns, entire forests, all hit by a combination that should never fall from the sky: fire, hail, and blood. What seemed distant now burns before our very eyes. The biblical narrative associates judgment by fire and hail with ancient and momentous events. In the Exodus, when Egypt hardened its heart against God's voice, one of the plagues included precisely this destructive storm. Years later, on the plains where Sodom and Gomorrah once stood, divine justice came in the form of brimstone and fire. These precedents are not only historical, but paradigmatic. They show how God deals with persistent arrogance, and by repeating these elements in Revelation, the message is clear. The pattern has not changed. In our days, even without trumpets, the earth continues to burn. The year 2020 saw devastating fires on 5 continents. In Australia, more than 180,000 square kilometers were consumed by flames. In Brazil, the Amazon and Pantanal saw thousands of hectares disappear in a matter of weeks. And in California, a combination of extreme heat and negligence created the worst environmental scenario in decades. These events, in addition to being tragic, reveal what happens when livestock is treated as a disposable resource. The sound of the second trumpet no longer targets the land, but the salty waters. An object of gigantic proportions, similar to a burning mountain, hits the seas. The impact turns the waters to blood, mows down marine life, and breaks a third of the ship's structure. This description echoes the Exodus, when the waters of the Nile were transformed, making it impossible to drink and killing aquatic life. But what was once localized is now global, and what once served as a lesson to a king now serves as a signal to the entire world. The sea is more than just a body of water. It represents circulation, trade, food, and climate balance. More than 50% of the oxygen we breathe comes from the oceans. 8 billion people depend, directly or indirectly, on the seas for their livelihood. Yet, the United Nations has recorded that, each year, more than 8 million tons of plastic are dumped into the oceans. Species disappear, corals die, and once lush areas become submerged deserts. The destruction of marine life also impacts trade routes. Approximately 90% of world trade is carried by sea, so any collapse in this area represents more than just environmental loss. It represents scarcity, inflation, despair. When John wrote his vision, maritime trade was already vital. Ports like Ephesus, Pergamum, and Rome were centers of economic power. A disruption back then would have been devastating. Now, it would be catastrophic. The third blast hits the rivers and freshwater springs. A star called wormwood falls from the sky and contaminates a third of the waters, making them bitter and lethal. The choice of the name is not accidental. In ancient Hebrew, wormwood was synonymous with extreme bitterness, a symbol of the consequences of idolatry and corruption. In Jeremiah, God had said that he would give the people bitter water for having abandoned his ways. In the Apocalypse, this prophecy takes shape, not only as a metaphor, but as a tragic reality. Today, more than 2 billion people live without access to safe drinking water, according to WHO data from 2023. Rivers such as the Tigris, Ganges, and Yellow River suffer from critical levels of industrial pollution. Lakes are drying up, aquifers are being exploited to the point of exhaustion, and entire regions are becoming water risk zones. The bitterness of water is no longer just biblical. It is present in the data, in the reports, and in the bodies of millions who suffer daily from the lack of something as simple as a clean glass. But there is a second layer to the meaning of these waters. The Bible often associates pure water with truth, with the divine word, with the presence of the Spirit. When these sources are contaminated, it is not just a matter of physical harm, but of a spiritual crisis. Doctrines are distorted, ideologies are manipulated, truths are mixed with human interests. This type of contamination also kills, not the body, but the soul. The sequence of these three trumpets is not accidental. First, the basis of life. Then, the flow that sustains the world. Then, that which directly nourishes human beings. The land, the seas, and the springs. Each sphere of creation is affected, not by chance, but by consequence. There is no total destruction. The measure is partial, a third. And it is precisely this limitation that reinforces the character of the warning. There is still room for return. There is still time to recognize that everything that has been wounded is also what has always sustained. If creation groans, as the Apostle Paul says, it is because it awaits redemption. And this groaning intensifies with each rupture, each fire, each polluted river. It is not just a sick planet, but a sign. Something is being said, and not listening can be more dangerous than the disaster itself. With the land, seas, and springs already wounded, the gaze turns upwards. The sequence of events is not arbitrary. Everything starts on the ground we walk on, passes through what circulates around us, and then reaches that which governs time, the sky. Not just as a physical space, but as a symbolic reference to order, stability, and the rhythm of existence. The fourth trumpet brings no explosion or noise. It affects what has always been considered constant, the light that regulates the day, the night, the seasons, and life itself. The narrative reveals that 1/3 of the light from the sun, moon, and stars is obscured. This does not mean a momentary eclipse, but a profound change in the functioning of the cosmos. What has always marked the beginning and end of the day begins to fail. The natural clock of creation is disrupted, and with this change, the entire balance is affected. Since ancient times, light has been associated with revelation, divine presence, and clarity. In the first chapter of Genesis, before any life form was created, God's first order was, "Let there be light." From then on, everything came into existence with purpose and direction. When this light is reached, the signal that is emitted is not just one of climate change, but of spiritual rupture. Creation returns to chaos, to the state of disorientation prior to the established order. This partial darkening has direct and symbolic implications. In the physical realm, changes in sunlight interfere with photosynthesis, global temperature, and agricultural seasons. The human body, for example, is regulated by cycles called circadian rhythms, which depend on natural light to control sleep, mood, and hormonal functions. When these cycles are disrupted, the impacts are visible: increased depression, insomnia, emotional imbalances, and even outbreaks of metabolic diseases. In regions with extreme winter, where the sun disappears for long periods, there are consistent records of an increase in cases of psychological disorders linked to light deprivation. In terms of the atmosphere, there are historical events that illustrate how the darkening of the sky can cause mass panic. In 1780, in the northeastern United States, a phenomenon known as the Dark Day was recorded. Reports indicate that, even in broad daylight, darkness covered entire cities, leading many to believe that doomsday had begun. Centuries later, studies pointed to forest fires and masses of smoke as possible causes. Still, the psychological impact of this event showed how the sudden absence of light profoundly shakes human perceptions of security and order. In the spiritual realm, the loss of light carries another meaning. It represents the denial of truth, willful blindness, and the replacement of divine revelation with fabricated ideas. Throughout biblical history, darkness has been present at times of judgment. When Egypt refused to free the Hebrews, one of the plagues was dense darkness, so deep that you could feel it. At the moment of the crucifixion, between noon and 3 in the afternoon, the sky darkened in an inexplicable way. It was not just a weather phenomenon, but a manifestation of the gravity of that moment. If this message is making sense to you so far, write Amen in the comments. It's a way of showing that you're together in this reflection. The darkening that affects a third of the celestial bodies in Revelation serves as a warning of the loss of reference. When the light fails, directions become confused, calendars lose meaning, agriculture falters, and the cycle of life suffers. But there is an even deeper implication. The widespread darkness reveals the state of the human soul. A society that rejects what is true, beautiful, and just tends to walk in the shadow of doubt, denial, and self-sufficiency. And when this happens, not only is the light of the heavens lost, but also inner clarity. There is a striking detail in this sequence. The fourth trumpet does not bring total destruction. It partially affects what it illuminates, allowing one to still see, but with difficulty. This reduction in brightness symbolizes an invitation to vigilance. When the light diminishes, more attention is required, more effort is needed to discern the path. What was once evident now requires sharper perception. This is the sign that something has been compromised, but not yet concluded. At this point in the vision, the rhythm of events is interrupted by a singular image. A flying being, similar to an eagle, appears in the skies. Its presence is not just decorative. His voice cuts through the remaining silence with a direct warning. Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth. This triple repetition is not poetic, but intensifying. What has been seen so far was just the beginning. Nature was shaken, but now, from that point on, the focus would no longer be just on the physical world. Humanity, with its choices, beliefs, and rebellions, would be placed at the center of the action. It is interesting that this pause occurs just after the sky darkens, as if it were necessary to remember that, when the light weakens, what is hidden tends to emerge. And when this happens, what emerges is not always easy to face. With the sky wounded and the light weakened, the world finds itself plunged into a heavy atmosphere, not only of physical darkness, but of spiritual confusion. It is in this scenario that a new trumpet sounds. Unlike the previous ones, which affected the natural elements, this one provokes a type of rupture that cannot be measured by environmental destruction or economic collapse. It goes deeper. It shakes the invisible structures of the human being. The image that emerges is not of land, sea, or stars. It is an abyss being unlocked. The story describes a fallen being being given a key. This is no ordinary star, but a spiritual entity. a messenger with authority granted to open something that has been sealed since ancient times. When the key is opened, a thick cloud rises from the depths, further covering the remaining light. And from this abyss emerge creatures unidentifiable by ordinary nature. They do not follow natural patterns. They do not have animal behavior. What emerges from there is a manifestation of torment that cannot be explained by physical phenomena. The description of the creatures that emerge is symbolic but detailed. They are called locusts, although they do not devour plants. They have features that resemble war horses, human-like faces, teeth like those of lions, long hair, bodies protected by armor and wings that make noises similar to racing cars. Their mission is not to kill, but to injure. Their target is not the environment, but people who do not carry the seal of divine protection. And their power is limited to a specific period, 5 months. This suffering has a unique characteristic. It does not produce death, but rather a desire to die. The pain generated by these creatures is so intense that many will seek ultimate relief, but will not find it. This is not ordinary physical torture. It is an inner torment, a type of affliction that affects the conscience, the sense of reality, the very will to exist. The text points to a pain that goes beyond the body. It touches the soul. There is debate among scholars about what exactly these beings represent. Some see them as real demonic figures, released at a specific moment in history. Others interpret them as symbolizing deep spiritual crises, such as mental breakdowns, mass outbursts, emotional destruction, or even manifestations of oppressive ideologies that cause mass anguish. Either way, the effect is the same. Inner peace is removed. What is left is despair. There have been periods in human history that recall this type of collective torment. During the First World War, reports from soldiers in the trenches reveal outbursts of absolute panic, vivid nightmares even when awake, loss of sense of time and space, and a constant desire to end the suffering. Similar situations have been recorded in prison camps, regimes of psychological oppression, and among victims of destructive cults. These are experiences that indicate how the human mind, when subjected to extreme spiritual pressure, can break down in irreversible ways. The text also mentions the name of the leader of these creatures, Abaddon in Hebrew and Apollyon in Greek. Both mean destroyer. This being does not arise by chance. He commands what comes out of the abyss, and his action is not chaotic, but permitted. This confronts us with a reality that is often avoided. Not all affliction is a lack of control. There are torments that are instruments. There are pains that are part of a greater calling. The presence of the seal of protection over some individuals also reinforces this idea. Not everyone is affected. This indicates a spiritual distinction, a separation between those who have remained steadfast in their covenant and those who have abandoned the source of truth. The seal is not merely symbolic. It represents belonging, identity, and preservation in the midst of crisis. It is important to remember that the torment mentioned here does not arise without context. It comes after successive rejections of correction, of the call to repentance, of the truth that had been offered. It is not a random punishment. It is the result of long and continuous resistance. When the truth is repeatedly denied, other voices take the floor, and these voices do not always lead to freedom. This moment in the narrative is the darkest so far, not because it shows large-scale destruction, but because it reveals a type of suffering that cannot be seen. A silent pain, without any apparent wound, but with a profound impact. A crisis that does not affect the body directly, but corrodes what is inside. The gaping abyss is not just a place, it is a condition, an absence of meaning, a continuous fall, a state where light does not reach and where screams do not echo. Those who find themselves there do not know how they got in, but they feel they cannot get out. And meanwhile, the world around them continues to fail to understand that the greatest prison may be where no walls are visible. The suffering that emerged from the abyss seemed unbearable, but it was not enough to break human resistance. Even after months of spiritual torment, the world did not retreat. Instead, the harshness intensified, and the next blast heralds something even more severe. No more inner anguish. Now lives are being cut short on a scale never seen before. The sixth trumpet marks the release of a direct judgment without disguise or metaphor. Death sweeps across the earth in gigantic proportions. The following description reveals 4 entities held by the Euphrates River, released at just the right moment. They were not released by chance. They were kept under control until the determined second, day, and year. This reveals a disturbing fact. Judgment is not the result of chance. It is planned, authorized, and executed within an order that escapes common perception. Nothing happens outside of time. These 4 beings unleash an army so large that its numbers defy all logic of the time. John hears the total, 200 million. In the reality of the 1st century, this figure was unthinkable. Even today, a military force with such simultaneous reach would seem impossible for any nation to organize. What is described here is not just a military action. It is a movement on a global scale, a mobilization that transcends physical borders. The destruction caused by this army affects 1/3 of the human population. The Earth, previously marked by selective plagues, now suffers massive loss. The imagery used to describe the horses and their riders indicates that this force does not resemble traditional troops. Lion-like heads, armor of symbolic colors, and fire, smoke, and brimstone issuing from their mouths. There is no doubt that the language here is loaded with symbolism, but it points to one concrete thing. This is an act of violent judgment, and its effect is actual death. Historically, wars have always been shocking because of their brutality. In the last century, 2 major world wars left their mark on every continent. The Second World War alone resulted in more than 50 million deaths. However, the scale described here surpasses anything ever recorded. 1/3 of the population was wiped out. In today's terms, that would be equivalent to the extinction of billions of people in a short space of time. Interpretations of this passage vary widely. Some see a literal army formed by nations that will face each other at the end of time. Others see a spiritual force, a judgment coming from on high, using visible elements as catalysts. There are also those who associate these events with nuclear conflicts or provoked pandemics, given their scope and fatal effects. But regardless of the reading, the message is clear. There will be an intervention so comprehensive that no one will be able to ignore it. Still, the most surprising thing is not the scale of the death, but the reaction of the survivors. After devastation, regret is expected. It is hoped that humanity, wounded and unstructured, recognizes the gravity of the situation. But what we see is the opposite. Those who remain stuck in the same mistakes. They do not abandon idolatry. They do not abandon destructive practices, nor do they renounce the vices that feed collapse. There is an insistence on maintaining the old ways, even when everything around points to the urgent need for change. The text lists specific practices: murder, witchcraft, prostitution, and theft. These actions are not just moral violations. They reflect a crumbling value system, a humanity so self-centered that it no longer recognizes the difference between truth and deception, between justice and perversion. The term translated as witchcraft, for example, is linked to the use of substances and spiritual manipulations, indicating addictions and dependencies that control the entire being. Sexual immorality is not restricted to the body, but also points to spiritual infidelity, the exchange of truth for momentary desires. And thefts and murders reveal a world without respect for life, for others, or for the sacred. This passage reveals a pattern. Suffering does not guarantee transformation. Pain in itself does not awaken consciousness. Destruction, however shocking, can be ignored by hardened hearts. What is presented here is a stark and raw portrait of human obstinacy. Even in the face of collapse, the attachment to error remains. It is as if humanity is determined to maintain its autonomy until the end, even at the cost of everything. This attitude has direct repercussions in our days. Even in the face of environmental catastrophes, extreme inequalities, existential crises, and emotional illnesses in epidemic proportions, there is widespread resistance to spiritual reflection. The prevailing discourse seeks only technical solutions, structural reforms, scientific advances. All of these are necessary, but insufficient if the problem is deeper. When the root is spiritual, no policy can solve it, no ideology can correct it. This is where the biblical text touches. The source of destruction is internal. The war described here is not just a battle with weapons, it is an exposure of what has been cultivated over centuries: pride, independence, denial of the truth. And when these elements ripen, the fruit is bitter. The consequences are visible. But even so, the eyes remain closed. The refusal to change reveals the real problem. It is not ignorance, it is choice. And every choice carries its result. The refusal to change, even in the face of loss, reveals the heart of conflict. This is not a battle between visible powers or human ideologies. It is a silent clash between pride and truth, between forged autonomy and ignored dependence. When the trumpets sounded one by one, they were not just heavenly sounds, they were warnings, each stronger than the last, intended to awaken a humanity that chose to close its ears. But then all is silent again, not by omission, but for another reason. The seventh sound, unlike all the previous ones, does not announce destruction. It is not accompanied by fire, nor darkness, nor screams. It brings a declaration, not of terror, but of possession. A voice rises on high, proclaiming that the dominion of this world has been restored to its true king. It is no longer a call, it is a decree. The time of warning is over. Authority is resumed. This moment marks a definitive change. What was once divided between light and darkness, truth and deception, is now put back in order. But this restoration is not generic. It separates, defines, identifies. Those who remained steadfast receive comfort. Those who ignored the warnings reap the results of their own decisions. Good and evil cease to be disputed concepts. They become clear, recognizable, non-negotiable boundaries. In the midst of this new reality, there is a singular gesture. The heavenly temple opens. There is no veil, no barriers. Within it, the Ark of the Covenant appears, a symbol that, for centuries, remained hidden. This revelation is not accidental. It communicates that the promise made from the beginning has been kept, that, despite all resistance, the divine commitment to rescue has not been abandoned. All around, there is thunder, lightning, tremors, but within, there is covenant, there is justice, there is permanence. The contrast is intentional. The world trembles, but faithfulness does not waver. In all the trumpets, one pattern repeated itself. The judgment was never total. Destruction, always partial. The objective, always the same, to awaken. But not everyone wanted to listen. And now, when everything is exposed, when there is no longer any place to hide intentions, reality imposes itself with force. The time for choosing has passed. This outcome should not be read as a grim end, but as a revelation that no injustice will remain unnoticed, that all suffering, even the most hidden, will be addressed truthfully. And that order, even after chaos, will be restored with precision. What remains in the face of this reality is not fear, but the question: what was done with the time given? What was built with the freedom offered? The trumpets sounded, and their echoes still resound. Not everything has been silenced. Some voices still speak, some consciences still feel, and as long as there is a response, there will be meaning. Because judgment is not the end of the story. It is the place where justice stands, where what was confusing becomes clear, and where everything that has been said finally finds its conclusion. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.